the idea of AI replacing people's skills in employment was front and center from what you get from the media a little bit, and not so much from my experience or anybody I knew. It's all very much coming from the potential fear factor of new technology and the media making it sound like it's running out of control. And I just tapped the brakes and I said, "You know what this sounds like? This sounds like a great opportunity for visual, creative, and technical people to come together and get to that next step of evolving creativity, like the camera back in the 19th century." So that was my metaphor in thinking. When I studied in college, fine art, there was also photography as a degree, and the photography students were meant to be commercial photographers, but they all wanted to be like painters. And they wanted their art to come through in photography, but they also had to be at this school that was promoting getting people into jobs. And so the camera was like a tool, not an art form. And yet it could be. So back in the day, our grandfathers, grandmothers maybe would have been confronted with the camera as a means of quickly making images of your friends and family or dog or whatever. You could never paint or draw, but you had the ability to have that image. And now I see AI, text to AI generation. People can type in things and somewhat quickly get some imagery they would never be able to make on their own with traditional skills. And I love that comparison, so that the end user is going to determine what the the drive of the AI to image will go to. So for me, as a professional in the visual effects industry, I don't need to make images by typing in text. It's not going to happen. I need to take the technology of building a model and using that similar generative process to make a better simulation that then we can go and put into our process of making for a final product in a game. And others that I spoke with that are, in a similar vein in the industry, are looking at that in a very similar way. Take the technology that's Chat GPT or Diffusion, in making the machine do some of that iteration to get you closer to what your art director wants without you or a team of people having to make a lot of steps, a lot of iterations. Now, there's no magic software that's doing that exactly for the general public, obviously, but I think the general public needs to have AI, this text to AI software to play with, to get the companies to make some money, to invest more into it, to refine it. And then folks in the industry like myself will find ways of adapting some of that technology to our very specific needs in the pipeline of a production.
So when Katzenberg mentioned that it's going to reduce 90% of all the jobs and the industry will just be few guys. Um, is there some truth to that?
Well, I mean, if that were completely true, to me, it sounds like the end product is not going to be well crafted. Because part of my limited experience in playing with this technology is you don't get a lot of great quality by just inputting a little bit of effort. quite the contrary. And I kind of talk about this in the article. It is not intuitive for us to think in words what we want to create visually. And there's no way that is going to change. We are not going to evolve into text prompt creative individuals. What instead will happen is that software will have to somehow evolve the interface so that you don't have to think of the right coded words to make that kind of look a little different to match the goal of what you're trying to achieve with an image. Now you take that image and you want it to move, that's even a bigger reach. So I see that could happen eventually and possibly a way that's not photorealistic. Because with photorealism, it's always the same problem. Are you in that uncanny valley? What little element tipped the hand to show you how it's broken and not real versus a stylistic or a very playful looking animation, for instance, could have more flexibility in those images in that presentation. And that may make it easier to sell an animated, sequence versus trying to do something photoreal. So if 90% of the people went away, is it just writers? I mean, is the writing going to be that amazing? Is the creativity in there? I don't know. Is it really being creative? It's not really being creative.
I think that we're not gonna tap into like why did he even like what did he mean by why did he say it?
No.
It sounds to me that like what you're trying to describe is that the IT guys that are behind these tools so far at this point, text to image process, that's kind of like a demo or like for what they could do.
Yeah.
Are you suggesting that the professional production ready pipeline will actually be more about different tools that we don't still imagine or we're not having them being tested on our end? So all we have is just to think about the text to image, and then we're panicking like, oh, text to image means it's done, but professionally we don't really operate like that. So you're foreseeing that the tools will be different, and then this will be more like the text to image is more like a interface help, right? Is
Yeah,
that
first steps. I think everyone probably, I would imagine most folks are not going to consider the current state of how you interface to be anything more than just playfulness. And that's fine. It's probably best that it's out there in this state and people are using it and building more data for it to then sample. But honestly, it's already getting into folks' hands that are developing very specific uses that I was suggesting. So that idea of taking a model, building a model to learn and iterate on something that you input, and you control that, and then you can control the output better than just typing in text. That's already in the works, and it's really in those corners of the industry where that the software engineers are working with the artists for a contract or for a project. It's very much dialed into a specific need. For the general populace, again, I just wonder if like you have all this imagery being generated sort of naively that's then going to be the source from which it'll pull from to make more images. And I alluded to this idea of you photocopy a photocopy enough and you just have noise, which is ironic because you start in the text image AI world with a noise and extract an image from it. But eventually, if there's nothing but really cheesy looking images out there being generated by AI driven artists. I'm like, I don't know if that's going to be the quality that'll replace 90% of people out there in the industry.
But it sounds like you are quite excited about the future.
Oh yeah.
Is
So for me, it's excitement in seeing this ability to one generate imagery from almost this magical concoction of words. As an artist and not a professional with my career, I see that as a golden way of opening up all sorts of just playfulness that could be not realistic, but could be potentially based in reality and yet make some very interesting imagery that maybe you could think up of. Maybe you could cook that up on your own, but maybe not as fast.
like you sent me, I asked you for these images, like for the article, the
Yes.
me in the bottle, and then you concluded your image when you said like this sort of represents like my experience with VFX. Perhaps you meant like with understanding the physics and how it works. Like, what did you mean by it?
And I wouldn't suggest my experience was successful. So it's worth noting that I gave you like three kind of goofy images of a genie and then one more photorealistic that didn't have a genie but had some implied effects that were like a genie. And I worked at it to a degree that I felt I was not going to get exactly what I wanted in my mind. And I also felt like there is or I felt like in that experience of trying to get a desired result, I was at my end. I could get different results, but not better. And what I found, I was using Firefly for that process, but I played around with, and I've worked with a friend who's working with Midjourney, another software that is a little more. He's subscribed to it and has a little more control in that way, but you're not going to really just use text to make those finer refinements to an image. You can take it out of that context and apply some other ways of editing it further, but is that better than me just then going into Photoshop and taking and layering a couple other elements and making it look perfect? It's not. It's different, but it's not better. And I would suggest in a visual effects context, I would not try to make a finished product of a simulation with AI. It could be done, but I personally would not go down that path. I would look for making creative choices in maybe with even animation with the simulation of emotion that I could leverage in some other software that we use to make our effects, but not as a final, here's the render, not in what we do. Creating an image for me begins mentally in my mind, typically. Or it may also include scene reference in reality, so motion, right? I don't often think of the motion correctly in my mind, but I understand what I think I need. And to look at reference of video to get the idea of the motion or the scale of an effect. Then you can start to assemble your idea or the art director's concepts, your idea, that reference of motion, and those are all elements you can then translate into your software that makes the visual effects. So in one way, that's similar because that's kind of artificial to then going ahead and typing in prompts and expecting to get back a little animated simulation. Instead, back in the day, you might sculpt with your hands the shape of a wave or draw with your paintbrush and pencil the contour and the silhouette of what you want your fire to look like. And that was what Disney did. But they also looked at actual fire, the animators. And in a way, that was probably closer, less removed technically from the final result. But when you don't have those things that you're physically creating, and you have to type on a keyboard, well, is that your native language? It's going to be in English, probably. And maybe that's a removed step. And then are your words good enough for what your mind is imagining? And by good enough, it's not your problem, it's how the machine translates your text into what it knows. So that too is evolving. That's getting better. But at the end of the day, when I wanted a blue-green color to my cat's eye, it was not green enough. So what do I say? More green? I don't know. I mean, how many times would you have to say it? So I think in a way, the process we've evolved to make visual effects, we're not doing practical, or I'm not practical effects. So it's not real. But in the computer, we can do certain things that we've been trained to do. So, like I'm AI now, I'm being trained to use those tools to get something that looks like if I did it in real life. And then we put that into an image, right? Obviously, that's not real, but that's layered images in a composite, and then it's on the live action plate that's filmed, and it all kind of sells the illusion. But that's almost as artificial as what you could do with text to AI, except we've gotten used to that process over the years, going from live action, real effects of an explosion to then making that look in a computer with numbers you type in for your simulations to then, I mean, that kind of feels natural now. So I think the AI, text to AI, and this is why I'm excited, will get you, the individual, to a place that you can get comfortable. It won't be figuring out the perfect text, but it'll be manipulating the input in a way that's useful for you to really make some good choices of the final look, the final result. And that's why, again, I don't know why all these people are going to lose their jobs, because someone has to make good choices to work that software. It's not going to be the art director only just editing millions of AI generated images and animations.
You got me thinking with that phrase garbage in, garbage out. Sometimes I'm so frustrated that I try to iterate like on a single idea, like with already having something, yeah, I like that, can you just try this? Like you mentioned, like color eyes, bluish more, a little bit. It's like, how do you explain that? So the garbage in, garbage out, that's a fascinating way to put it. Most of us will not actually be or become so savvy with words in order to describe what we I think more naturally think through in images anyway. When we start talking curse words, what I do is I imagine what those what those meanings are. And I don't see a text written, I
Right.
see like when you talk about shit,
Yeah.
I see shit.
Yeah. You're a visual
That's
person, right?
and it's like it doesn't happen naturally. Like it's just a word, it's no, it's not.
That's a great point. And I think, again, I feel the same way too. I sort of have I try to find alternatives to that situation. And oftentimes I like to play with words, but not in a way that I'm trying to get stuff done. Like I try to be really clean about when I give direction to my teammates. This is exactly what we're talking about, not sort of kind of. But I like to play around with the ideas. And this is where, like, for instance, I would love to play around with text prompted AI, and I will. But I'm not going to have expectations of like getting that final look. And I'm actually not going to try. I would prefer, let's play around with some prompts and just see what we get, And then let's be from that go and maybe not current state of software, but take those, feed them back in specifically to then add more, not chaos, but playfulness and not trying to be photoreal. So again, the idea is really you keep showing me things that the light will go on. And I don't know why, but I know if I play around enough and edit, there may be a thing there that's a nugget to keep. And a lot of times that's sort of that artist happy accident moment where they're playing with the watercolor and it just dried on the paper a certain way and they can't do it twice. They just don't touch that. That's just right the way it is. And then you got to move on and you can try to get that elsewhere, but you can't really. So in a similar way, I would embrace this now in a playful, wacky way and not try to be like, hey, we got to get this done by end of day because it's due tomorrow deadline kind of way.
Let's say you're a junior and you're thinking it's like what tool will I actually go and invest my time into learning? Right now at the moment it's not going to happen right away, but it's coming, that the production ready tools will come. It's like, where would you invest your time? Like, even you as a professional, where would you invest your time so you don't feel like you end up being behind?
Yeah, for sure. And I think you kind of suggested it by talking about the way of thinking. And so, in a way, I imagine what's currently how we build our pipelines in a procedural way so that we can swap, an asset in and out of the workflow and it won't require you to change the whole workflow. We want to be able to understand, hey, we're going to run the simulation to do some generative machine learning. You have to be in control. You have to understand the inputs that are relevant to what we want at the output. And again, that so no garbage in because we don't want garbage out. So you're going to understand what's the important data we put in and what do we leave out. And that I don't know is specific to any like, you know, absolute terms, but that way of thinking will make your generative machine learning process more efficient. And you won't be just a button pusher. You'll have to be like, hey, if I mix a little of this and a little of that, I know that data together will get me closer to the end result when it makes, 6,000 iterations. And that would be this. It sounds abstract, but it may be very intuitive if the software evolves to make the user's experience, sort of a visual one and not text driven. And understanding that will then that'll be your role. You will have you're a visual effects artist, but you're not running the simulation. It's running and you're feeding in the data. And it may never stop running. You just keep feeding in or maybe taking out data points to get that, end result closer to what the camera needs to see. It's always dependent on your what's your end product. Let's just say it's a film or it's a game that you look through a camera and you can be trained to understand that process for that role. Whereas maybe if you're a character animator, it's all going to be, again, little subtleties that the machine, hasn't gotten learned on or understood, but you were trained in that by drawing it. And you can apply some data inputs to get that nuance that would otherwise just be mechanical. And that's again, like it's not the same exact training. Your skill in learning animation just needs to be put into the user experience with the software that says, hey, you want this little extra nuance. These are the data points, and this is where you feed it in, and you can see, pretty immediately whether it worked or not. That's what I'm hoping the skill set will become. is take your real skill and talent and then understand how that UI, that interface uses your skill and what inputs you need to modify or change so you get that result your art director wants.
Reliving the same thing as what we're going through 20 years ago when CG was taking over the 2D, and yet we're panicking the same way as like the older generation back then was panicking, when we were like excited about the technology.
Yeah.
And yet it didn't make us less artists.
We take for granted that AI is derivative. So I don't think it is making anything that wasn't there before, right? So the goal of the writer, a successful creative writer, is to say or communicate something that wasn't done already, and in a way or evoke an emotion in a creative way. And I'm not sure that is just a derivative process. I think you can get to I don't know because I'm not a writer, but I with visuals know you can get to places accidentally with certain combinations. I'm a big proponent of collage and bringing imagery together that shouldn't be together to, sort of translate a different emotion or idea. And I'm sure writers have something similar in being creative and taking their reader on a journey with quirks and turns and twists. Um, but you look at literature, like, if you read a classic piece of literature, those words to me are just a vehicle to tell a greater, bigger story. It's not that immediate circumstance that's happening to the character. It's talking about the human condition. It's talking about some greater, bigger context. So would AI do that? Like by accident, maybe? But I don't know. I haven't tried it. Maybe you could program it to be like, I want you to tell an allegory about, this thing and that thing of the human condition, but frame it into a story set in the 17th century based on a family whose father died. All these things that make up an interesting piece of classic literature. Yeah, guess you could punch all that in and it might work, but it feels like it would almost be easier if you had the talent to just do that yourself.